I never would have guessed when I was 9 years old that we would be living at a moment like we're living in now, where there's an epistemological crisis, a lack of confidence in facts and in truth.
Hello, and welcome to On Purpose. Today, I am joined by Alan Murray. Alan is the CEO of Fortune Media. Alan, welcome.
Thank you, Kristin. Great to be with you. Thank you for having me on.
For most of the time, I'm watching you interview people on stage, so I'm going to turn the tables a little bit today. I definitely want to get to your book, but if it's okay, I want to start first a little bit with your childhood, which I think always informs who we become as leaders. And I loved the story of how you started off as a journalist at 9 years old. Why don't you share that story with our listeners?
When I was a kid, I started walking up and down the neighborhood street and asking people about their visiting relatives or their lost pets. And I would take notes, carefully write it out on paper, and then take it home. And this was my mother's typewriter.
Oh my gosh.
And she would have to type the whole thing out, and then I could put the carbon on a jelly sheet and run off 30 copies, and I sold them for a nickel in the neighborhood.
I think that's a fascinating story. And I think also growing up in Tennessee in the 1960s, I also have to believe shaped a lot of who you've become as a CEO and as a leader. Talk to me a little bit what the soul of business means to you.
As a lifelong journalist, I really always thought of myself as someone whose primary job was to explain the world, not change the world. I realized, particularly over the course of the last decade, that business leaders were talking very differently about their jobs than they ever had before. And it was in a much more human way. And that's what sort of pushed me on this exploration of what was changing in business. Why were businesses talking differently about their social responsibilities and social obligations? And I have a colleague, Jeff Colvin, who said, we spent a good part of the 20th century trying to make people act like machines. We've seen over the course of the last few decades a pretty dramatic change in where the value in business comes from. It's much more human. And as corporations have recognized that they have to be more people-focused, that inevitably gets you to focus more clearly on your values. It's not a conversation you could have had with business leaders 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or 30 years ago. But I think it's a conversation that makes sense.
So one of the things you talk about in the book a bunch is the human-centered corporation. So talk to me about what does that look like and some of the examples that you mentioned in the book that were most compelling to you about what a human-centered corporation looks like.
One of the things I did for the book is I found this piece of research where they had gone to Fortune 500 companies in the 1970s, said, where's the value coming from in these companies? And if you looked at the balance sheets of Fortune 500 companies in the 1970s, what you would find is more than 80% of the value was physical stuff. It was plant, it was equipment, it was oil in the ground, it was inventory on the shelves, it was physical stuff that you needed financial capital to buy and support. And so maybe in a way it makes sense that the principal focus at that time was on returns to shareholders, providing the financial capital, which lets you accumulate the stuff that allowed you to win. But if you do that same exercise today, it's intellectual property, it's computer code, it's brand value, the passion that your brand ignites in the customer. It's all things that are centered not around financial and physical capital, but around human beings, around human capital, around people and the connections between people. These just have to be more human because it's that human factor that will determine the degree of their success.
I would say you may have moved from the skeptic, which I think you probably would have described yourself as maybe 10 years ago, let me know, to someone who really believes there's a change and you think the future of capitalism 2.0 is going to be different. So talk to me a little bit about that.
Having a new generation of companies that say, you know what, I have to take on the environment as a corporate responsibility. I have to think about the good of the society I operate in as a corporate responsibility, because if it's not healthy in the long run, I'm not going to be healthy. It's also the best thing for my business because I can attract better people. I can generate more loyalty from my customers. I can do all sorts of things better if I have that focusing on clear contributions to society.
How do we measure whether or not we were successful?
We're at the very beginning of understanding how to measure returns to other stakeholders, how to measure returns to the environment. And a lot of people are working on these metrics questions, but it's very early days. So I think it's kind of messy. And it's probably going to be that way for a while. There's a lot that needs to happen.
If you could go back to your 9-year-old self who was starting that newspaper and give him some advice, what would be your reflections on your amazing 50-year career of, the future ahead?
I never would have guessed when I was 9 years old that we would be living at a moment like we're living in now, where there's an epistemological crisis, a lack of confidence in facts and in truth. And business has emerged as the pragmatic center. The people who say, well, wait a minute, we have a climate problem. There's got to be a sane way to address it. Or we clearly are having, inequality is a growing problem in our societies. What can we do to address it? It's the reason why, having spent the first 2 decades of my career covering government and the last couple of decades covering business, I'm encouraged by the actions that I see happening in the business community to address some of the big problems that we face.
Alan, I want to thank you for joining me, especially with everything you've got going on at Fortune and the launch of your new book, Tomorrow's Capitalist. So thank you for joining me, and thank you for joining us for On Purpose. I look forward to seeing you again next month.